Hello and welcome back to Fixing Fallout 3. Last time we took a detour to make some changes to the side quest, The Power of the Atom, which would better explore society in the settlements of Megaton and Tenpenny Tower, as well as the brewing conflict between them. Although it is not technically part of the critical path, it would be assumed that a new character would most likely have completed this questline, in order to access better gear and gain crucial experience, before leaving the area around Megaton. By this point, the player would probably be prompted by one of several motivations to make their way towards the DC ruins. Firstly, the Overseer's final instructions to you were to find your enigmatic father, the father that you never knew you had, as you were raised as an orphan in the vault. If unraveling this mystery is important to you, then you most likely would have been enticed by Moriarty's promises of information, and this may have even led you to support his coup in Megaton. Frustrating to the last, his only remaining clue points you to DC, where the local radio DJ supposedly knows more about who your father was and where you can find him if he's still alive. Alternatively, you might be motivated to track down the people who attacked your vault and kidnap most of its population. With Vault 101 inaccessible after it was destroyed, your best lead would be to find any information about the other local vaults and investigate there. There had been rumors that the Overseer had lost contact with other nearby vaults before yours was attacked, but you don't actually know where any of them were located. However, Megaton was founded by people trying to get into Vault 101, and if you ask with some of the elderly locals, they might steer you towards Vault-Tec's DC headquarters, located deep within the city ruins. Finally, you might be motivated purely out of a desire to learn more about this world, and possibly involving yourself with one of its disparate factions. The only notable faction in Megaton were the Children of Adam, but you might also have opted to travel with one of the trade caravans to some of the other I-95 trade settlements, where you undoubtedly would have come across the other local factions in your travels. One way or another, however, you would eventually be compelled to travel to DC. Recall my video on geography. Some of the most notable changes were that we resized the map so that it actually centered on Washington, and that we made the radioactive Potomac River an actual barrier to progress. Both of these changes will come back into play during this part of the story. Making the short trek from Megaton to the river, the player will come to find the crossing occupied, and this will be their first introduction to the Talon Company, which in our rewrite will be promoted into one of the 4 major factions of the game. Like in vanilla, they're a no-holds-barred mercenary company operating for the highest bidder, only they won't be initially hostile to the player, and their operations will be majorly expanded in scope. Speaking of the guards on the bridge, you will come to find out that their newest contract is to restrict access in and out of the DC ruins, and if you press them, you'll find out that the mercenaries don't even know why they've been paid to do this. They're only following orders, and they probably won't be making an exception for you. In the previous chapters, you might have heard me mention a combat rescale. In my experience, Fallout 3 is one of the more challenging Fallout games, given the scarcity of ammunition in the early game. However, we could also increase the difficulty and make combat more strategic by changing how damage is done to certain enemies. In this case, these will be the first armored enemies you encounter, unless you had previously opted to side with the tribals against the Brotherhood outcasts, and remember that you had to use pulse weapons for that. Without very powerful ballistic weapons able to penetrate Talon Company's professional combat armor, there would be very little chance that the player would be able to defeat this squad on their own. However, having previously taken the bad karma path will again provide shortcuts. If the player had sided with Moriarty in his coup, then they would have been provided with their very first companion, Jericho, who used to be a mercenary. With his help, you might be able to overpower them. Or, you might talk to them, and learn that Jericho used to be familiar with these other mercenaries. With him around, the player would be able to get by the squad peacefully. Alternatively, if the player sided with Tenpenny in destroying Megaton, their prize would have been a large cash bonus. Perhaps enough to bribe the commander to let you by if your barter skill is high enough. But if the player doesn't have access to these resources, then they will have to search for an alternative path into the city. If you somehow had access to lots of anti-rad meds, you might be able to brute force your way across the river. Otherwise, you might investigate the nearby settlement of Wilhelm's Wharf, a trading town which made their living off of those crossing into the city, but now is mostly deserted due to the blockade. They won't directly confront the mercenaries for you, but they might be convinced to help smuggle you across the river if you could find engine parts for one of the destroyed boats in the marina. For these, they would direct you to the nearby settlement of Grey Ditch, recently founded by scrappers prospecting in the western ruins. Here, of course, is where the player would come across the giant ant side quest. I like this one, we can keep it. If the player follows this route, the town will prosper for a time due to the new smuggling business, but they will eventually be wiped out by Talon Company once the ruse is discovered. Otherwise, the player will be forced to travel north or south to search for another crossing of the river. To the south is Arlington and the Pentagon, where the main sect of the Brotherhood of Steel is located. For now, they will remain a complete mystery, primarily staying within their fortress and completely ignoring the outside world. This slice of the wasteland is eerily quiet. You don't see any signs of life, which would suggest that the Brotherhood routinely clears their territories of any mutants or hostiles, but you don't see any of them, almost as if you're nothing but a bug which doesn't even register on the radar. You might ask, if the Brotherhood isn't out defending the wasteland in this version, why do they still have a schism with the Outcast? Needless to say, but you will be returning to the Citadel later in the story, and these questions will eventually be answered. Following the river north, you will find Arafu, the bridge settlement besieged by vampires in the main game. I think this side quest is a little too silly, even for Fallout, so I wouldn't mind cutting it. I would give the town a major upgrade, however, as it's the last free river crossing located directly on the interstate. It would naturally be a major hub for caravans and traders. Given its importance, no one would dare destroy the crossing, so its bottleneck position would also make it virtually impregnable to assault. If we wanted to keep the point about a siege, we could say that they were being harassed by Talon Company, or perhaps through raider proxies. With the town militia fighting back along with you, the player would easily be able to reach the East Bank. Making their way south, they would travel through the junkyard and meet Dogmeat. I think being guided here rather than stumbling upon this location is a more natural fit for finding the player's first companion, at least if they hadn't already picked up Jericho. Taking this northern route would show that, although more difficult, taking the high road in this game is not without reward, and can often lead you to parts of the world that you would not have discovered otherwise. Whatever the route, the player would now enter the northwest section of the city. Here I have to mention a pet peeve that I, and I'm sure many others, have had with this game. If you've played Fallout 3, you already know that neither the DC ruins or the metro tunnels which connect them have a proper map. This can make exploring these areas extremely tedious and confusing. Having played Fallout 3 several times over, I can still easily get lost in these areas, and I have to rely primarily on the tenuous lifeline of a quest marker to guide me where I need to go. This is frustrating because there's so much interesting content buried within these ruins that Unwilling goes completely unexplored by the vast majority of players, because it doesn't happen to be directly on your way to your next objective. I understand that the city areas were separated from the overworld due to engine limitations. For comparison, look at how taxing Fallout 4's open city areas are on frame rate, and consider that Fallout 3 was made in 2007. I think it justifies this decision. Fortunately, there's an easy solution to this problem. It would make exploring the DC ruins much more intuitive by giving many of these world chunks a connection that isn't through the metro, as well as including a world map exclusively for the ruins. So, at this point you've made your way into the city and are heading towards GNR. Here, we're going to leave the combat sequence against the super mutants mostly intact. The big difference is that instead of the power armored troops being the Brotherhood of Steel, they'll instead be Riley's Rangers. You might remember these guys as being a small sub-faction of mercenaries in the main game. Or perhaps you don't, as their side quest is one of the many hidden away in one small corner of the ruins. But here they'll also be receiving a major promotion into one of the game's main factions, essentially fulfilling the role that the Brotherhood of Steel played in DC in the main game. After you help defeat the super mutants, you'll be led inside to meet Three Dog, who basically acts as the spokesman for the Rangers. Despite being a mercenary company, he genuinely believes that if they could only defeat the super mutants and take full control of the capital, the Rangers could establish order in the wasteland and begin to forge a functioning state out of the ruins. This mission is his brainchild, along with the current leader of the Rangers, Riley. As you'll come to find out, Riley's Rangers are really descendants of U.S. Army Rangers, deployed to the capital in fear of an impending Chinese insurrection before the Great War, while Talon Company were special forces stationed at the nearby Adams Air Force Base. Following the war, these two military remnants initially served as protectors and first responders, defending against the insurrection which was inevitably launched by the Chinese remnants, based out of the Mama Dolce's plant in East DC. However, the two companies eventually began to fight over territory and dwindling resources. Settling into the new reality of the wasteland, both factions became little more than mercenaries, selling out their protection to the highest bidders. For decades, the Rangers controlled the Pentagon, but could make little headway into the ruins, often themselves collapsing into prolonged periods of warlordism, splintering into smaller squads with mercenary captains competing against each other for prestige and wealth, hoping to gain the coveted fortress position in the Citadel. Following a bloody campaign of reunification, Riley's father managed to unify the group under his leadership, until it eventually passed to her. It seemed like it would be a new beginning for the Rangers and the Wasteland, as Riley began to dream of transforming the Rangers from a mere mercenary company into an organized force which could police and govern the region. That was until the mutants attacked. It began as a rumor. Humanoid yellow giants lumbering out of Appalachian forests, leaving towns and tribal settlements empty, picked clean like corpses. They were eaters of the dead, dragging survivors away to a grisly, unknown fate. Immediately, ranger squads were sent into the mountains to investigate, and none ever returned. By this point, most rangers were crack hunters and warriors, honed by years of combat against animals and raiders, but they had never faced a threat like a super mutant before. These won't be the bullet sponge brutes of Fallout 3, but rather a deadlier and more serious version, more akin to their appearance in classic Fallout. They are a race bred for war, fashioning weapons and armor out of junk and wielding them with deadly effect. In combat they are completely silent, and yet act with uncanny precision. For all the Rangers threw at them, it seemed they only grew stronger and more numerous, until what remained of the Rangers were forced to rapidly cede ground as the mutants slaughtered their way through the capital wasteland. Riley began to contemplate withdrawing the Rangers, along with any human survivors who remained, into the Citadel to prepare for a desperate last stand. But when all hope seemed lost, the Brotherhood arrived, fresh from their sacking of the pit, having traveled across the continent in pursuit of one goal: eliminating the mutant threat wherever it arises. Between the two armies, the mutants were routed, but not destroyed. You might already have noticed the roving bands of mutants that still wander the wasteland, almost aimlessly, and since then their source has still not been found. But the mutant war took its toll on the wasteland. Nearly half of its inhabitants were either killed or kidnapped, which could provide an in-game reason why, even with our expansion to the settlements, the world may still seem depopulated. The Brotherhood, far from embracing the role of savior of the wasteland, instead demanded immediate occupancy of the Citadel as payment for their aid. Riley, recognizing that the Rangers were in no position to stand against them in their weakened state, ceded the fortress without a fight, which the Brotherhood promptly occupied, and has since taken no further involvement in the politics of the wasteland. It was not till very recently that the schism between the Brotherhood and the Outcasts arose, but the details of that conflict are still murky to all outside the Citadel. After their exile, the Rangers were at their lowest point, robbed of their base of operations, surrounded by enemies, and with seemingly nowhere else to turn. Riley made the difficult decision to lead her people into the ruins, the labyrinthine concrete carcass of the once great city. There, against all odds, she managed to carve out a base for her company, by forming an unlikely alliance with the radio DJ, and beginning the Herculean task of ridding the city of mutants and other hostiles. With Galaxy News Radio playing PR, the Rangers have slowly rebounded and begun recruiting volunteers, anyone willing to fight the good fight, reclaiming the capital block by block until their bloody work is done. Progress had been steady until recently. A sudden mutant counterattack disabled their broadcast tower and left some of the Rangers stranded behind enemy lines, including Riley. The death of their leader would be a disaster, but Three Dog believes that without their radio signal, the Rangers will be trapped inside the ruins and slowly suffocated in a war of attrition against the mutants and possibly Talon Company. This would lead to a dilemma where Three Dog asks you to repair the radio tower first, while the Rangers desperately beg you to help search for their trapped squad. Prioritizing one over the other would lead to consequences. Either the tower would be permanently damaged, or the trapped squad would be killed, resulting in a significant loss of faith with the spurned party. This dire situation provides a more reasonable explanation for Three Dog withholding the information you need, and forcing you into taking one of these side quests before he'll help you. The Rangers are in crisis, and without buying them any breathing room, Three Dog simply doesn't have the time to help you. And if you let his radio tower be destroyed, he might not choose to help you at all. Of course, I think the option of killing him or bypassing these quests should still be open, but like Moriarty, a first-time player would most likely end up helping him. I won't change much about the Galaxy News Radio or Riley's Rangers quests. Fallout 3 was made back during the era when Bethesda was really on their A-game when it came to side quest and dungeon design, and some of the moments from these quests are real highlights of the game. The only additions I would make in this area would center around the design of the National Mall. I love the look of it, the sheer visual aesthetic of this place, once the centerpiece of American grandeur reduced to a bombed-out war zone. My problem is that it's almost completely lifeless outside of the legion of enemies spawned here, with only the player to oppose them. Sprinkling in some more Rangers in this area would help give it the appearance of being an actual front line of combat, and might even set up opportunities for dynamic skirmishes. These fights would also give the player some cover, and would make it easier for them to traverse this area when they first arrive. Remember, at this point the player is probably only equipped to take on 1 or 2 mutants at a time. Secondly, I would take the opportunity to do some more world building. An alternate version of the Korean or Vietnam memorials, or perhaps even statues of alternate presidents, would do some great world building for the alternate history aspects of the Fallout universe. Doing the side quest to rescue some of the trapped Rangers will take you to Vernon Square. After rescuing them, or finding their bodies if you delayed, you will find out that Riley was taken to Underworld after being injured, and of course you will be tasked with tracking her down. While you're there, you might also visit the Vault-Tec HQ. I won't change anything about this dungeon. I would only add a quest guiding you there in order to download the locations of the other vaults. You would also learn that one vault, 108, is registering unusually high levels of activity, while all the rest are completely dormant. So that would be your next lead in tracking down the kidnapped citizens of Vault 101. The final change I would make is that it should be much harder to reach Underworld. It just doesn't make sense to me that such a persecuted group like ghouls would advertise their position by posting guards outside. I know that in-game they say that they are protected by the presence of the super mutants, and realistically this is done to guide the player towards Underworld, but I think the same effect could be accomplished through a quest, and it would give a lot more mystique to the settlement if it was harder to reach. Underworld could be reached either by going through the Museum of Natural History, which is infested with ghouls. You might remember that a scientist in Underworld is experimenting on them, trying to find a cure for ghoulification, or by traveling the way most reach the settlement, by navigating through a path in the subway tunnels, which ghoul pilgrims call traveling the River Styx. After finding Riley, you'll be tasked with establishing peaceful relations between the ghouls and the Rangers. This will be a fairly complex process, as although the ghouls have nursed Riley back to health and are treating her well, they are basically holding her hostage, as they worry that releasing her will lead to the discovery and ultimate destruction of their settlement. Orchestrating a treaty will require gaining their trust. Otherwise, the player could organize a Ranger expedition to wipe out the settlement against Riley's wishes. After doing these quests, you will have built a decent reputation with the Rangers, and now that the situation is stabilized, you will have more than earned their information you need from Three Dog. In-game, you may have heard him mention on the radio that he was once a wasteland adventurer. What he tells you about your father will relate back to those days. He tells you that he was once recruited by your father into a band of mercenaries, seeking a pre-war military ruin in the mountains to the far north of the capital wasteland. This group consisted of a large cast of characters who you might recognize as some of the most colorful in the wasteland, including Moriarty, Tenpenny, and Three Dog. The others were your enigmatic father, who organized the expedition, Madison Lee, a distinguished scientist who had been accompanying your father since before he formed the group, Dukov, a mercenary and scoundrel who has since gone on to open a popular brothel, Dave of the Republic of Dave, and a fifth member whose name Three Dog doesn't remember. You might recognize this list of characters as some of those involved in the side quest, You Gotta Shoot 'Em in the Head. If you don't recognize this quest, it's probably because it's tied up with an infamous bug, in which picking up the Operation Anchorage power armor set automatically completes the quest. This suit is also bugged with infinite durability, and is a set of power armor that is one of the easiest to access early on in the game. Because of this, I am willing to bet that most players of Fallout 3 have never even completed this quest, including myself. Essentially, it guides the players towards some of the Wasteland's most colorful characters, and culminates in a large dungeon in the far north, in the north of the Wasteland. Like the Riley's Rangers side quest, I will be incorporating this in the critical path, in order to guide the player to these characters, who are spread out across all corners of the Wasteland. Of course, the player can ask Three Dog about each person's backstory, and their relationship to the expedition. Basically, Three Dog will explain that the expedition was slowly whittled away with casualties, from attacks becoming almost constant. As they got closer to their target, it was almost as if something was fighting against them, using the wasteland itself. Three Dog was himself one of the first to leave, escorting Dr. Lee back to civilization after she was wounded early on in the expedition. He knows that the others survived, as they have since become influential players in the wasteland, but the fate of the expedition remains a complete mystery to him, as well as the location of your father. He can only assume that they turned back before they reached their destination, which he can't point you towards since he never made it there himself. From this point on, there will be a major divergence in the critical path, where the player is free to pursue any lead that they think will provide them the best information. Of course, they might make a beeline towards the north, hoping to find the fort. This option is probably only viable if the player has already completed the game. Three Dog himself will point the player towards Madison Lee, who has joined up with the Brotherhood and is now spearheading Project Purity in the Jefferson Memorial. Although she left early on in the expedition, she knew your father from before it formed, and is the most likely to provide you with some concrete answers. Dukov now runs a brothel out in the wasteland. Going here will require interacting with the raiders of Evergreen Mills. Dave runs the infamous Republic of Dave. Coming here will see the player traveling to the outskirts of Baltimore, and engaging with the Plague of Deathclaws in the area. And finally, it's a safe bet that the player has already interacted with Moriarty and Tenpenny at this point. Moriarty was merely the logistics coordinator for the expedition, and never departed on it himself, while Tenpenny was the financier. The player might choose to backtrack and speak to them if they haven't already. From this point on, they're free to pursue any of these leads, or continue to explore DC at their leisure. Of course, you already know that all of the others are just red herrings, and Dr. Lee is the only one that will provide any meaningful information, so we will pick up with her in the next chapter. So that was part 4 of my rework of Fallout 3. Did you enjoy it, and is there anything that you would add? Let me know in the comments, and stay tuned for part 5, The Replicated Man.